Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 189 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Today, we're living in a period of climate change. Since the mid-19th century, human activity has increased the amount of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. And as these gases are ones that trap heat in our atmosphere, temperatures are increasing, which means glaciers are melting, sea levels are rising, forests are dying, and, well, wildlife is just trying to adapt to all of these conditions. So, how will humans adapt to and endure this change in our climate? Will we adapt and endure? Historians can't predict the future, but it turns out they can help us explore the past, where we'll find that the people who lived in early America also lived through a period of climate change, albeit a very different type of climate change to the one we're experiencing today. Sam White, an associate professor of history at The Ohio State University, has recently researched and written a book about the Little Ice Age. And what he found is that this period of climate change greatly impacted initial European exploration and colonization attempts of North America. And this is what we're going to talk about today. Now, as we investigate the Little Ice Age, Sam reveals what the Little Ice Age was and when it took place, evidence historians, climatologists, and glaciologists use to study the Little Ice Age and its impact, and details about how the people of early America experienced the Little Ice Age. But first, don't forget to send me your questions for episode 200. What would you like to know about the history of early America? Email me, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Also, I'm hosting a very special listener meetup here in Boston on Sunday, July 8 at 10 a.m. This meetup will take place the day after Boston History Camp, which is an awesome event that you should just try to attend. Okay, so History Camp is a day-long event that brings together people who love history. So you don't need to be a professor or hold any degree in history to attend. You just need to love history. Because at History Camp, you will spend a full day discussing and exploring all different types of history with others who share your passion. Now, I'll be speaking at History Camp as part of a panel on the morning of July 7. And then on the morning of July 8, we'll meet at Boston Common, right on the corner of Park and Tremont Street. And I will lead anyone who shows up on a tour of my hometown with an emphasis of Boston's role in the American Revolution. So we'll visit Boston Common, the Granary Burying Ground, and see sites like Ben Franklin's birthplace, the Old South Meeting House, Faneuil Hall, Paul Revere's house, the Old North Church, and we'll also take some time to stop at lesser-known sites, like where Governor Thomas Hutchinson's mansion once stood. Then, after our tour, which will take us approximately 2 hours, we'll head to one of my favorite spots in the North End for lunch and a drink. So come meet up with me in Boston on July 7 for History Camp and on July 8 for a tour of Boston. Now, we're also going to have another meetup this summer. On July 21st, we're going to meet up in Cleveland. Now, I can't offer you a tour of the city because I don't know it that well, but we are going to meet up and have a good time. If you know Cleveland and you have ideas about where we could meet or maybe even something we could tour together, let me know. Send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Okay, I know that was a lot of information, lots of dates and details. Don't worry about it. I've posted the dates, details, and links for all these events and meetups on the show notes page and in your Ben Franklin's World app. All right, I hope you have your winter parka ready, because we're about to venture into the Little Ice Age.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an associate professor of history at The Ohio State University. He's an expert in environmental history with a focus on big history. His first book, The Climate of Rebellion in the Early Modern Ottoman Empire, focuses on the far-reaching effects of severe cold and drought in the Middle East during the Little Ice Age. And his second and most recent book, A Cold Welcome, The Little Ice Age and Europe's Encounter, explores the efforts of Spanish, English, and French explorers and colonists to grapple with a new and unfamiliar climate in North America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Sam White.
Thank you for bringing me on.
Okay, I think we should begin our conversation here with big history. What exactly is big history, Sam, and how does your interest in the Little Ice Age fit into that field?
Big history was a concept originally developed by David Christian, professor of history then at Macquarie University in Australia. He was teaching a world history course and expanded the scope of that to look at how human history fits within the entire history of the cosmos, Earth, and life history. So it's a course that helps us explore both the history of the science. How do we know these broad scientific historical paradigms of Big Bang cosmology, plate tectonics, and Darwinian evolution? And how can we see the scope of human history within that much, much larger picture? Another way of thinking of it is that it's the modern creation story, only one informed by our contemporary scientific evidence. It's one that's informational as well as inspiring and sometimes poetic. It's a course I've very much enjoyed teaching over the last few years and look forward to continue teaching.
So big history is really just this idea that we can go from the Big Bang to the present and use that as a useful periodization for study.
Well, that's part of it, but it's a way of nesting different scales of history into one another. So when we start with the Big Bang, what we're looking at is the shape of an origin of complexity and structure in the cosmos. Then when we narrow down to Earth history, we can look at the forces of geology that help shape the Earth and its atmosphere in the form that they're in. Then we can, in turn, nest life history within that, looking at the course of evolution and the principles of Darwinian evolution and how our own species fits within there. And then as we narrow down, we look at the human history, but we can do so from a more conciliant approach, bringing in the insights from different sciences.
So it sounds like you use science as your historical source or evidence. And I'm guessing that you also use science in conjunction with other more traditional sources. Sources that we would think of as traditional historical evidence, like correspondence and journals, municipal records. I guess what I'm really getting at here is printed sources.
Exactly. So my interest in that is really twofold. One is to explore the history of the science, which is always a useful field for students, as well as to explore the science of history, to actually be able to use tools from the different natural sciences to explore the human past and fit it into larger context. And to get back to your first question then, that's part of what interests me in terms of looking at the Little Ice Age. It's a way in which we combine both written evidence from a variety of human observations in different forms, along with the physical evidence of different kinds, whether it comes from tree rings or ice cores or many other new types of climate proxies that climate scientists are now developing.
I'm glad you brought up the Little Ice Age because Kate would like to know what the Little Ice Age was, when it took place, and really how the temperatures of the period would have compared with the temperatures we experience today.
So that's a big question. And I think it helps to step back and look at how the term was developed and how it's been used. So the term Little Ice Age was originally one used by glaciologists, people interested in the study of glaciers and their historical advances and retreats. And what they noticed is that even in between the great ice ages that have defined the last couple of geological epochs, roughly the last 2 million years, in our interglacial times, there have occasionally been advances of glaciers, smaller advances of glaciers. And this is what they've termed Little Ice Ages. Eventually, this expression, Little Ice Age, came to be used specifically for the maximum extent of glaciers in our current Holocene epoch, which is an interglacial epoch. And that maximum extent of glaciers occurred roughly between 1300 and 1850 CE. Now, over time still, the expression Little Ice Age came to be used by more than glaciologists. It came to be used by climatologists, especially paleoclimatologists, that is to say scientists who look at how we can reconstruct past climate. And they started using Little Ice Age to refer to the period between roughly about 1400 and 1800 CE, when average global temperatures were a little bit cooler on most or all of the continents, certainly in the northern hemisphere during the summers. Now, how much cooler depends exactly on where and when you're looking at. So it's important to note the Little Ice Age was not uniform across space and time. There were colder generations, there were colder years, and some parts of the world were more affected than others. That said, on average, the cooling was, roughly half a degree centigrade compared to what we see in the mid-20th century, which is typically the reference period. And that's comparable to the amount that we have warmed since that period, now in the early 21st century. Actually, probably a little bit less than we have warmed since then. So when we're comparing current temperatures of the Little Ice Age, we have to consider that we're looking not just at the Little Ice Age compared to what we might think of as normal temperatures, long-term averages, but Little Ice Age compared to what are now unusually warm temperatures brought about by man-made global warming.
If I understood what you were saying, then the Little Ice Age came from this idea that there was this maximum size that the glaciers reached, and that they reached that size between 1300 and 1850.
Well, the glaciers themselves are more a representation of climatic change than a cause of it. So they were the most visible manifestation for later scientists of this climatic change. In fact, we can do a great job of tracing the movement of glaciers over time, from everything from the exposure of lichens to looking at old drawings and pictures, which show how much greater they used to be. However, we have since developed all sorts of tools, and by we, I really mean climate scientists, not myself in particular, have developed all sorts of tools to help reconstruct past temperatures, especially summer temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere. So no longer will we just identify the Little Ice Age with glaciers. It's really more identified with periods of cold within that larger era between about 1300 and 1850.
So what exactly caused this period of climate change between 1300 and 1850?
So there are at least three big timescales to think about when we address that question. One thing to consider is that over the very long term, that's to say over the last few thousand years, we have seen a gradual, almost imperceptible, but nevertheless probably real cooling of Northern Hemisphere summer temperatures, which has been brought by orbital changes. Basically, there are small shifts and wobbles in the Earth's orbit around the sun, which have just gradually led to this high cooling in Northern Hemisphere summer temperatures. At some point, it seems, that cooling accelerated, and it accelerated through what are known as feedbacks. In particular, there was most likely an ice albedo feedback. That is to say, as it got cooler, ice started to expand around parts of the Northern Hemisphere, probably especially Arctic Canada. And as ice expanded, it reflected back more light into space, which slightly accelerated that cooling, which in turn led to more ice. It's thought, although not universally agreed upon, it seems to be gaining acceptance in the community of paleoclimatologists, that large tropical volcanic eruptions in the late 1200s may have set off this ice albedo feedback process, which slightly accelerated this cooling, especially Northern Hemisphere summer cooling. So that's the bigger picture here. In the medium term, there could have been other factors leading to colder dips of a decade to a few decades. These may have to do with solar cycles, sunspot cycles, although that theory is by no means universally accepted. There may have been, in the late 1500s, a period when, as the Earth was cooling, soil took in more carbon from the atmosphere, so basically driving a greenhouse effect in reverse, although that is just a hypothesis which will need further support. There are natural oscillations in periods of decades, specific decadal oscillation, North Atlantic oscillation, which can also contribute to regional cooling. But the single most important factor, both on the scale of years to possibly up to a few years or even a decade or so, was probably large tropical volcanic eruptions. If large volcanoes erupt with enough force in the tropics, they can inject sulfates up into the stratosphere. And those aerosols will spread across the globe in the stratosphere and reflect back a little bit of sunlight. And that slight dimming will lead to cooling that leads to also changes in atmospheric circulation, which can lead to more severe cooling in parts of the world and shifts in weather patterns. They just might also have some sustained feedbacks in terms of atmospheric and oceanic circulation, which can sustain the cooling a little bit longer than the, say, 3 to 5 years at most that those aerosols stay up in the stratosphere. I apologize, a bit technical, but hopefully that's the clearest explanation that I can give of these different timescales of cooling.
You know, I notice we've been talking about cooling and warming and climate change, and none of your explanations have mentioned snow or rain or hurricanes. So I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about the relationship between climate and how it might have impacted the weather that early Americans experienced in North America during the Little Ice Age.
That's an excellent question, because climate doesn't usually have a direct impact on human life. Rather, it's weather that has a direct impact, and these larger climatic changes are expressed or surface in terms of changing weather. So what you often see during phases of the Little Ice Age, especially in the wake of large tropical volcanic eruptions, is not just global average cooling. It's especially nasty kinds of weather for human activities. including cold, wet summers that ruin crops, or in other places, freezing, dry winters that can kill crops or livestock. In the phase of the Little Ice Age that A Cold Welcome focuses on, from the late 1500s to early 1600s, we probably also saw stormier Atlantic seas, which affected sea crossings. And we probably saw some expanded sea ice, at least after 1600. There seems to have been a change with more sea ice in the North Atlantic. So it's those kinds of actual physical manifestations on the ground, affecting weather day to day, season to season, that really had the human and historical impact.
Now, how do you as a historian study the Little Ice Age? And by that I mean, what kinds of evidence do you consult to figure out that 1300 to 1850 represented a period of global cooling? Do you just rely on scientific data to tell you that?
So in climate history, there are two broad types of evidence that we look at. On the one hand, we have evidence from paleoclimatologists, or evidence from, we can call the archives of nature. Basically, physical remains that record some kinds of natural processes that give us indirect representations of climate variables. That sounds a little technical, but the simplest example is probably familiar to most people, and that's growth rings in trees. The way in which trees grow, especially if they're stressed either by limits of precipitation or by limits of summer growing season temperatures, are going to lay down growth rings in varying widths that are going to have some expression of that climate variable, what we call a proxy of that climate variable. There are many other types of proxies that could exist in these natural archives that include the sediments at the bottom of lakes or ice cores in glaciers or in the Arctic and Antarctic. So by combining different proxies, even though each is an indirect representation, we can get a broader overall sense of both regional and global climatic trends. Now, to understand the human impacts, though, we usually have to combine this evidence from the archives of nature with evidence from historical climatology, the study of past climate and weather from records left by people, the archives of societies. These include a wide variety of sources as well. Everything from narrative descriptions that might have been left in old chronicles and old diaries, other types of proxies, phenological or ice proxies. In other words, people who may have kept regular records of when the trees, grew their leaves, or when the grape harvest took place, or when the grain harvest took place, or when certain lakes or rivers froze. The work of historical climatologists over the last decade has enabled us to use those archives of societies with ever greater confidence and precision in many parts of the world, especially in Europe since about 1500. What I tried to do in A Cold Welcome is take some of that experience and some of those methods and try to bring them into North America by the time we get the first European contacts. And although we can never get a perfect picture of past climate and weather, my hope was to do the best we could with the limited evidence available, both physical and written.
Okay, now that we know a bit about what the Little Ice Age was and why it happened, I think we can start exploring some of the specifics about how the Little Ice Age impacted the efforts of the Spanish, English, and French to explore and establish colonies in North America. So, Sam, would you tell us about the Europeans and colonists who migrated to North America during the Little Ice Age? What exactly were their ideas about climate and weather, and what of those ideas did they bring with them across the Atlantic?
Excellent question. So this is the most important factor to consider. Even had there been no Little Ice Age, there still would have been a lot of difficulty in dealing with the climates of North America. For Europeans in the 16th century, climate wasn't really the same concept that we have today. Since the 19th century, roughly, since the rise of modern meteorology and meteorological measurements, there's been a tendency to think about climate as average weather. Going back to the 1500s, however, climate was more a geographical or cartographic concept. In other words, climate was seen as being a property of a place, and you would assume that it would be more or less the same along the same lines of latitude. Now, this was a terrible mistake to make as Europeans crossed over the Atlantic, because they were basically moving from a maritime climate, as we find in most of Western Europe, to a continental climate that we find in most of the eastern United States and Canada. The difference here is that the prevailing atmospheric circulation over the mid-latitudes is from west to east. It's not strictly so. There's, sometimes northerly or southerly circulation as well, but primarily it is west to east. So what that means if you're in Western Europe is that the predominant air masses and weather are coming from over the Atlantic. Oceans, large bodies of water, don't usually heat up and cool down as much as land does. So if you compare the situation in Western Europe to Eastern North America, you see the problem. In Eastern North America, you're primarily getting weather coming from over land that heats and cools more rapidly, and therefore brings greater variability from day to day, week to week, and season to season.
Now, how exactly did this European misunderstanding of climate impact their ability to establish settlements in North America? Would you tell us about the first attempts of the Spanish to establish a foothold in Florida?
So I think the important factors to consider when we go back to the earliest Spanish attempts of Ponce de Leon, for instance, was that they were coming from the Caribbean and first assumed that Florida actually was another island in the Caribbean, only gradually coming into the realization that it was part of mainland North America. In the 1500s, Florida's climate was not drastically different than it is today, although based on these early observations we have, there was a greater frequency of unusually cold winters, snowy winters. But probably the greatest obstacle the Spanish faced was the assumption that the climate there and the landscape should either resemble that where they were coming from, these expeditions largely from the Caribbean or Mexico, or that it would be much the same as it was across the ocean at similar latitudes, roughly that of North Africa. So they were expecting either more of a tropical climate or more of a Mediterranean climate. And of course, Florida has neither. It has, I guess you could say, subtropical, more temperate climate, and it certainly doesn't have the particular seasonal patterns of precipitation that you would find in the Mediterranean. So they often encountered conditions in Florida that were unexpectedly harsh, including more frequent snowfalls than they might have expected or some frosts. But probably most difficult for them of all was the fact that it didn't dry out in the summer for the ripening of crops, like in the same way that it would in the Mediterranean, and you didn't get then, reliable winter and spring rainfall, and then these hot, dry summers.
During the late summer and into the early fall, we often think of Florida and hurricanes as going hand in hand with one another, as almost being synonymous with one another. Did the Spanish experience any hurricanes while they were exploring and trying to establish a colony in Florida?
Yes, I was shocked as I was doing this research how often different ventures encountered severe storms. I can't necessarily identify all of them as hurricanes in retrospect, but definitely large tropical storms, identifiable by both the violence of the winds and the fact that the winds would come from multiple directions within a short period, indicating that they were probably coming from some kind of tropical depression. And it seems to be the case that hurricanes were slightly more frequent at the time. The indications of this come from two different kinds of sources. One are certain, usually sediments in lagoons or lakes, that show disturbance when you get storm force or hurricane force winds, and that leave a good record that climatologists can later uncover and date. So there seems to be more disturbance in that sense in this period, indicating more frequent storm activity. The other indication comes from looking at records of shipwrecks or reported storms in records of the Indies Archive coming from the Caribbean. And those seem to show a higher frequency of major storms, possibly hurricanes, during this period in the late 1500s. So I was really quite surprised to see that there's this uptick in storms corresponding with the frequency of hurricanes affecting different ventures in Spanish Florida and actually elsewhere in North America as well.
Lynn has a question about whether the Little Ice Age impacted the growth of crops and the grazing of livestock. But before I ask you Lynn's question, we should really talk about our episode sponsor. As we've been exploring, a long period of cold temperatures greeted early European explorers and colonists when they came to North America. And because these colder temperatures impacted weather patterns between 1300 and 1850, people from Canada to Florida suffered biting cold, frequent hurricanes, crop failure, and drought. So what did people who lived through the Little Ice Age think was happening? For a scientist like Benjamin Franklin, the Little Ice Age was likely more than just a series of random events. Franklin was a keen observer of natural phenomenon, or a natural philosopher as he would have called himself. And now, you can explore Franklin's many stellar scientific achievements, as well as learn even more about the man himself with the Great Courses Plus. To discover more about Franklin's upbringing, his parents, marriage, friends, political philosophy, and his religious beliefs, check out the Great Courses Plus's new course, The Age of Benjamin Franklin, with Professor Robert Allison. You can even take the class for free during the free trial the Great Courses Plus would like to give you when you visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Now, The Great Courses Plus has over 8,500 lectures in its vast library that will help you satisfy your curiosity about history, science, math, psychology, and about how to perform new skills like cooking, photography, and even speaking a new language. All of these fascinating lectures are presented by award-winning professors and experts in easy-to-watch 30-minute-long videos that you can stream, download, and watch all on your own schedule and on all your favorite mobile devices. So visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld to learn more about Ben Franklin and to delve into new topics just because they fascinate you. To claim your free trial of The Great Courses Plus, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Sam, Lynn would like to know what the Little Ice Age meant for the growth of crops and the grazing of livestock, which is a really great question because these are really important activities when you're trying to establish a colony in any place, let alone just Florida. So, would you tell us how the Little Ice Age impacted the colonists' and Native Americans' food supply?
Okay, so this is an excellent question, and I think there are really two parts to consider this. So one is how it may have affected European attempts to grow crops. And here, not every venture really even got as far as having a good opportunity to plant viable crops during an appropriate season. So in many cases, they simply did not bring appropriate crops with them. In some cases, they didn't bring any crops and assumed they would live from barter or perhaps extortion from Native Americans, or they brought inappropriate crops. There were attempts to plant Mediterranean or tropical crops in Virginia, for instance, that were almost certainly doomed to fail, or they arrived too late to plant crops in time. So many of them never really had a chance, even if there had not been a Little Ice Age. In other cases, though, we can guess that major droughts, such as faced the first Jamestown colonists, or untimely frosts, such as faced the Spanish attempts to first plant colonies in New Mexico, probably did have an impact on food supply. The other side of this equation, though, was how the Little Ice Age may have affected food supplies among Native Americans. That's harder to know, given the information we have, especially since we can assume that there was more familiarity with the local environment and its climatic variability, and therefore a little bit more adaptive capacity when it came to the climate anomalies of the Little Ice Age. Nevertheless, we do have some good evidence in certain cases that extremes of climate encountered at certain times, particularly in the wake of large tropical volcanic eruptions, bringing unusual weather patterns in the 1590s and the turn of the 17th century, probably did affect Native American food supplies, that the anomalies were strong enough they were simply beyond their usual adaptive capacity. We can see that certainly in the case of Pueblos in the Southwest, based on Spanish descriptions, and probably as well the Virginia Indians during the first years of the Jamestown colony, and possibly during the Roanoke colony as well.
You mentioned that Native Americans' food supply was likely impacted by the effects of the Little Ice Age, and Chris would like to know more about how the Little Ice Age would have impacted relations between Native Americans and European colonists during these early years of North American colonization.
I should preface this by saying, as I wrote A Cold Welcome, my primary interest was in how Europeans tried to deal with the new, unfamiliar, and unexpectedly harsh climate of a new world, in part because I saw in that some parallel with our own situation of confronting global warming. However, I was constantly drawn to the theme of the Little Ice Age and its impact on Native Americans and the way in which Native Americans and European newcomers encountered each other. To give some sense of this, I was very much intrigued by this unusual pattern of events or descriptions that I found in numerous narratives, well over a dozen early colonial encounter narratives, in which different Native Americans supposedly asked different European expeditions or groups of colonists to help them pray for better weather, usually either to help them pray for rains to come or to stop. And at first, I kind of dismissed this as being some kind of device among certain European travel narratives, perhaps to encourage the idea that Native Americans could be converted to Christianity. But really, the descriptions were so consistent in some cases, and what's more, matched almost exactly tree ring-based records of drought, that I was compelled to conclude that, at least in part, they must have been real. And what was further interesting about those kinds of encounter narratives is that they often turned out rather badly for Europeans. In some cases, for instance, they prayed for rains, had some sort of Christian ceremony, which they invited Native Americans, but then the rains never came, or that their efforts to supposedly appeal on behalf of their God with prayers end up making them look foolish because they end up suffering from the same consequences, or even suffering more from the same consequences of the unusual climate they were facing.
It really seems like no matter where you look in early America, there was usually violent conflict between Native Americans and Europeans. And this, of course, happened for a variety of different reasons. And I do wonder to what extent you think that the weather and climate of the Little Ice Age period may have caused some of this violent conflict.
That's certainly a good question. I mean, it would be easier if we had more peaceful examples as a counterpoint, because as you point out, there are certainly many sources of conflict with these ventures. I mean, often really little more than invasions, we could say. So I think we'd have to see climate in most of these cases as being just one contributing factor. But I think certainly it was an important contributing factor in many of them. It exacerbated key problems of food supply, which were so often at the heart of these conflicts. Many expeditions were sent out with explicit instructions to try to keep peaceful relationships with surrounding Native Americans, and they often failed in that. They often abandoned that goal when it really came down to whether or not they had enough food to eat and whether or not Native Americans had enough food to offer them.
So a lot of the evidence we have about the relations between Native Americans and Europeans during the Little Ice Age seems to come from European accounts. In these accounts, how exactly were Europeans describing the climate and weather of North America?
What you tend to see is, depending on the background and education of the writer in question, attempts, first of all, to fit the climate of wherever they're going in North America into the prevailing theories about climate. It's rooted in classical geography. However, there's usually either a grudging acceptance over time that the actual climate, or climate in our modern sense, the pattern of weather and season, didn't correspond to those classical notions of climate, or else they came up with interesting, often very clever, creative rationalizations for the discrepancy between climate in our modern sense and the climate that they expected based on latitude. For instance, there were a number of pamphlets by explorers in search of a Northwest Passage around Canada who came up with all sorts of clever theories for why it was that they were encountering extreme cold and sea ice in Canadian latitudes that actually only lined up to about the same latitudes as, say, Scotland, if you were to go to Europe. And they invented different ideas about how particular landscapes or the presence of ice would themselves produce cold. Or they came up with ideas about how the seawater itself shouldn't be able to freeze, so that ice must be forming on land during winters, but that didn't necessarily have any indication as to what summer temperatures should be in this part of the world. So they were often, clever, sometimes self-serving theories, but they showed that the encounter with North America's climate, similar to encounters with new landscapes elsewhere in the world, were forcing Europeans to come up with a sort of proto-science of climatology, something that would eventually be developed into an actual science of climatology.
I wonder if we could now explore European adaptation a bit more, because one of the really refreshing things about Sam's book, A Cold Welcome, is that it's not just a chronological story. It's a story that seeks to explore European colonization efforts across mainland North America. So it's not a history that just sticks to the Atlantic coast or just to the English experience. Sam also tells us all about the Spanish and French experiences. So in this spirit, Sam, would you tell us about the geographical mistakes the Spanish made as they explored the North American Southwest, and how those mistakes compounded Spanish misconceptions about seasons and weather?
One thing to keep in mind is that whereas Europeans were developing better techniques to measure latitude, they had no technique throughout this period that could reliably tell them about longitude. There were some early proposals that people came up with, but they were not in widespread use throughout any of the period discussed in this book. So whereas expeditions would often target a particular latitude on the eastern North Atlantic seaboard, and for that reason, I think latitude took on this outside role in terms of their planning and expectations. When they ventured into the interior, they often had a very poor idea of how far east or west they were, or how far east or west different lands were in relationship to each other. So, for instance, Richard Hakluyt, who played a major role in the promotion and planning of English colonial ventures, had a tract in which he talked about, New Mexico as being just on the backside of Virginia. So somehow you cross over the Appalachians and then you're there in New Mexico, eliding vast distances across the continent. The Spanish had some similar troubles as they ventured into New Mexico over different ventures. For instance, the Coronado expedition has a resupply mission that tries to reach it over water and then ends up, going up into the Colorado River before the hapless folks sent to resupply it realize that they are still hundreds of miles away from their intended destination. They just simply didn't realize how far they had to go. There were various speculations about how close New Mexico would be either to Florida on the one hand or to Zacatecas, Mexico on the other, really showing profound problems of geographical recognition in this venture. And although good information would occasionally come to light, there simply wasn't a good, steady development of solid geographical information that could be used to improve the planning of each venture. At the same time, there was the similar problem of latitude. Although we would now recognize New Mexico as having a classical southwestern desert climate because moisture coming from the west is blocked by the Rocky Mountains, and then you have occasional so-called monsoon summer rains that come up from the Gulf of Mexico during the hottest dry season, drawn by the heat and low pressure. The Spanish actually were thinking of it in terms of latitude, comparing New Mexico roughly to Israel. I mean, it's roughly on the same lines of latitude that they believed it was. And so expecting kind of Mediterranean climate. And it took quite some time for them to recognize that they were in fact encountering unusual weather and harmful weather when they were there, in the sense that the summer rains failed during certain ventures and the winter snows were worse than they usually were.
Another curious point I found when I read A Cold Welcome is that there are apparently a lot of historians who question whether or not Canada, or New France, experienced winters during the Little Ice Age. Sam, would you tell us why historians have questioned this and whether winter was an actual season in Canada during the Little Ice Age?
Well, what I meant by that in the chapter was specifically whether the winters of the Little Ice Age were exceptionally cold in Canada, particularly during the early colonial period. And the reason for that is that so much of our climate information, especially from tree rings, is specific to summer temperatures. So to understand exactly how cold the winters were, we need other types of evidence. And what is often most helpful is the direct records from the expeditions themselves. Sometimes there are other types of proxies that can give some rough indications of this, but very often we do rely on the kinds of descriptions of snow cover, snow duration, freezing dates, and thaw dates in order to get a sense of how cold these first winters were during the expeditions of, Cartier and Champlain.
Well, it seemed like from the way you described it that winters in Canada during this period were rough. So rough that scurvy was actually a really big problem for the French. And I found this really interesting because we normally associate scurvy with maritime culture, not with continental living.
Yes, so the main climatic obstacle to these early expeditions, really perhaps the main obstacle to these expeditions, period, was the length of the winters and the way that deprived colonists of fresh foods that would ward off scurvy. And in the expeditions of Jacques Cartier and the expeditions that followed, led by Roberval, the principal problem was that they simply were not familiar with scurvy at all. It was something that was not well known to them, so they had no idea what the cure might be. By the time that Champlain returns to Quebec, or for that matter, even to New England, at the end of the 1500s, scurvy was much better known because of more transoceanic voyaging, but there still wasn't a consistent medical theory of it. You could find people recommending, for instance, that lemon juice was a good cure for fresh greens, but then they might also recommend other things that had no curative power at all, like digging holes in the ground or burning trees or taking more exercise. So instead of having too few ideas, they had, in a sense, too many ideas to settle on the one that would be most effective. But it was in this sense that the Little Ice Age was probably most decisive for those expeditions, because with winters that were somewhat longer, growing seasons that were a little bit shorter, access to the kind of fresh food that would have reduced mortality from scurvy was often unavailable.
We've been taking a pretty wide view of the geographic expanse you cover in A Cold Welcome. And in keeping with that wide view, it seems from your book that Europeans had a really hard time adapting to North America and its weather during the Little Ice Age. And I wonder, given everything that you've seen in terms of your research and the evidence it's turned up, why Europeans and early colonists had such a hard time adapting.
So I think there are several reasons for it. One, and while this might sound like an insufficient answer, it's one that we should always keep in mind in history of events like these. That's bad luck. I mean, had they simply had some better luck with weather, better luck when it came to the timing of storms, the sharing of information, and so forth, they probably would not have had quite such a hard time of things. Another factor, though, has to do with the development of first Spanish colonization and then French and English competition. So for much of the period, going back to, of course, the early 1500s, Spain was still trying to defend an exclusive claim on North America. And that meant that a great deal of the experience and information of North American colonization attempts was hard to obtain in France or England. However, Spain's approach to these colonial ventures was to assign essentially monopolies of rights to different private conquistadors or companies who would then, in effect, be, gambling on big expeditions, mostly with the idea of conquering people rather than territory. So they were primarily interested in, creating encomiendas and in drawing wealth from that. That was a good way, in a sense, of harnessing private wealth, private ambition in the process of conquering Latin America, or what would become Latin America. But it worked poorly with North America. First, because the Native American population of North America was often too spread out to offer sort of single rich conquests, such as were encountered on the Aztec or Inca, but also because it meant that in moving to North America, there wasn't a continuous frontier of settlement. There wasn't a chance to gradually get to know the land and to develop a strategy for settling it. Rather, have these expeditions crossing over the Atlantic, crossing over the Gulf of Mexico, arriving in North America, and each trying anew to engage in ambitious conquest or settlement schemes. And they didn't necessarily do a good job of passing on information one to the other. And so there was very little ability to develop more knowledge about the geography of the climate and to find a way to adapt. Then towards the later 16th century, you get French and English rivalry to Spanish claims. Some of those expeditions were more focused on piracy, essentially, than they were on long-term settlement. So there was less of an emphasis on learning the land and adapting. And then by the time that these expeditions really do get their chance to move in on Spanish claims, primarily starting in the 1580s, 1590s, turn of the 1600s, that just happens to be one of the worst phases of the Little Ice Age. In fact, one of the reasons why they're able to move in on Spanish claims at the time is precisely because of the extent of agricultural disasters in Spain and the way in which they undermined Spanish tax collection, the Spanish treasury, basically forcing Spain to back off on its exclusive claims to North America, to accept French and English incursions, even at the possible cost of losing this territory. So there is, in some ways, a coincidence here, but it's also one driven by this protracted phase of unusual climate, driven largely by large volcanic eruptions in the late 1500s to early 1600s.
Is it possible to measure whether the Spanish, the French, or the English were more ill-equipped than the others to deal with conditions in North America? Or was their inability to adapt really just a factor of poor timing, like landing in an area during a period of drought or famine?
Yes, I think the clearest way to answer that would be just to say each expedition encountered specific problems with regard to climate and weather. But on the whole, I think what is most striking in terms of adaptation or lack of adaptation was the difficulty among subsequent Spanish expeditions to help contribute to a more complete, more accurate geographical and climatic picture of North America.
Tumek would like to know more about the impact that you think the Little Ice Age had on British, French, and Spanish colonial societies and when the Little Ice Age ended.
Well, the end of the Little Ice Age doesn't really occur until the 19th century. In fact, the 1810s turn out to be one of the coldest decades, particularly in North America. And that's because of two large tropical eruptions, one in 1809, and then the more famous eruption of Tambora in 1815, bringing on the so-called year without a summer in 1816. So by that time, the colonial ventures in North America have largely wrapped up.
Sam, before we move into the time warp, why do you think it's important for us to grapple with the Little Ice Age and the ways that it impacted European colonization of North America? Do you think that there are any lessons that we can pull from this period and use in our own day?
On the one hand, it does give us another perspective on these early colonial ventures. It helps us understand why so many of them turned out so poorly, why we have, in the words of the historian Karen Kupperman, this creation story from hell when it comes to colonial North America. But in terms of its present day lessons, I was very conscious of what this meant for us today in facing global warming. Now, I wouldn't say that our vulnerabilities are the same. And certainly the nature of climate change is different. We're facing a much more rapid change, and it's driven by our activities and not by natural forces. But I think human psychology perhaps has changed a bit less. And what this experience shows, facing a new, a variable, and unexpectedly harsh climate in a new world, it shows how difficult it is for us to really grapple with climate change, to really adjust our expectations, to make the adaptations that we need, often before it's too late.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the Spanish, English, and French colonists who confronted North America during the Little Ice Age had better understood the climate change of the period and how to adapt to it? How do you think the history of North America would be different?
I believe that the Spanish would have spread colonies, outposts across much more of North America before the French and English felt confident in challenging Spanish claims. In fact, it should really be surprising to us that the Spanish did not succeed in that, despite several well-funded, sometimes even reasonably well-coordinated ventures, especially the Tristan de Luna expeditions. So we shouldn't take for granted that any of North America should have been there waiting for the Roanoke colonists, the Jamestown colonists, much less the Pilgrims by 1620. It's really quite remarkable that the Spanish were not able to solidify their claims sooner, and I think they probably would have had it not been for their confusion about climate and the accidents of the Little Ice Age.
Sam, you've written 2 books about the Little Ice Age. Is there a third in the works?
I am not certain about that. Currently, my work has been focused on questions of methods in climate reconstruction and trying to get some more coordination in order in this larger field of climate history. So just this summer, I should have a textbook coming out, which I'm the lead editor of the Palgrave Handbook of Climate History. And I'm also engaged in a working group within the Past Global Changes Organization, or PAGES, sponsored by the Academy of Sciences. And we'll be developing a series of workshops and publications to try to improve our methods in reconstructing past climate variability risks and impacts using historical sources. Hopefully, I will have another history project, a history book, ready soon. But for right now, I'm taking a short break to think about what are the most pressing topics and issues I could address.
We've just had a whirlwind tour of North America, the Spanish, French, and English attempts to colonize it, and a whole lot of science. So we likely will have questions. How can we contact you with those?
Well, you can reach me by my email, white.2426@osu.edu. And I'm glad to take questions about history or about the Little Ice Age and past climate variability.
Sam White, thank you for helping us better understand the Little Ice Age and how it impacted European exploration and colonization of North America.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Studying the Little Ice Age offers us another perspective on colonial ventures and gives us another idea about why so many of the earliest attempts of Europeans to explore and colonize North America turned out poorly. Now, when we study the Little Ice Age, Sam encourages us to look at it from the vantage point of big history. With this really wide perspective, we can see that over thousands of years, there was a drop in summer temperatures between the years 1300 and 1850 CE, which is the period we know as the Little Ice Age. As Sam noted, this drop in temperatures occurred and accelerated because the wobbles in the Earth's orbit changed. This change contributed to more sunlight being reflected from the Earth back into outer space, which caused temperatures to decrease. And as temperatures decreased, glaciers and ice grew, which had the further effect of cooling the planet. As Sam pointed out, the Little Ice Age and its cool temperatures were not uniform across space and time. So some parts of the world were actually impacted more by this change than other parts of the world. And we know that one of those areas impacted more than others was North America. Continental temperatures there dropped and weather patterns changed. And these changes proved really problematic for European explorers and colonists because they didn't really understand what was going on. As Sam found, Europeans who lived during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries didn't really understand climate the way we do today. Instead, they thought of climate as a cartographic or geographic concept. In other words, they believed that places that shared a similar latitude would have similar climates and weather patterns. And as we just discovered, this was a big misunderstanding. Early Spanish explorers and colonists found that Florida lacked both the tropical climate of the Caribbean and the Mediterranean climate of Spain. The English found that Jamestown lacked a climate similar to France and Spain, and that New England was way more cold and had way more volatile weather than Old England. And of course, the French discovered that Canadian winters were so long and so cold that they suffered from scurvy. Today we face climate change, just as the early Americans did, but we face a different kind of change. Rather than cooling, our Earth is warming. So, will we start to experience long periods of violent conflict over food and water, as the colonists and Native Americans once did during the Little Ice Age? Will we find it more difficult to plant crops and keep our towns in good working order because of more frequent storms, as early Americans once experienced? Time will tell. But it is striking that Sam's research revealed that the people of Europe and early America found it difficult to grapple with and adjust to climate change. It's only with hindsight that we can see that they should have started adapting to the change much sooner than they actually did. Look for more information about Sam, his book, A Cold Welcome, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/189. Also on the show notes page, you will find links, dates, and details for our meetups in Boston and Cleveland. I'm really looking forward to seeing you soon, so be sure you check out those details. The Great Courses Plus has over 8,500 lectures in its vast library that will help you satisfy your curiosity on just about any topic you can imagine, including the age of Benjamin Franklin. To explore this new course about Franklin and all their other courses for free, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Finally, did our exploration of the Little Ice Age give you any ideas for how humans need to and might respond to the period of climate change that we're experiencing right now? I'm curious, and it really seems to me like we need all the ideas we can get, so please send me yours. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.